It started on a quiet Saturday afternoon in Washington, D.C., the kind of day when the sidewalks hum with casual weekend energy, people walking dogs, grabbing coffee, teenagers laughing in hoodies and sneakers. Among them was 17-year-old Jalen Carter, tall, soft-spoken, with a sharp mind and a love for sneakers and sketchbooks. He wasn't thinking about politics that day. He wasn't thinking about his father, or privilege, or danger. He was thinking about how his new hoodie matched his Jordan 4s and whether he should swing by the record store or just head home. He had his earbuds in, backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in hand, just a normal kid doing nothing but existing in public. That's when the patrol car slowed behind him. He didn't notice at first. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But the sound of doors slamming and boots hitting the pavement snapped him out of his zone. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Jalen froze. Two officers, white, mid-30s, approached fast. No smile, no calm tone. One already had his hand on his belt, the other gripping his radio. "What's in the bag?" one demanded. My sketchbook. School stuff," Jalen said, confused. The officers didn't pause. They circled him like a suspect. One yanked the earbuds from his ears. The other grabbed his arm without warning. "Stop resisting!" "I'm not," Jalen started, voice cracking in panic. But it didn't matter. In seconds, he was being shoved against the brick wall of a closed cafe. His backpack hit the ground. His phone slid across the pavement. One officer barked questions while the other patted him down aggressively. People across the street stopped walking. Some stared. One woman took out her phone, recording silently from behind a lamppost. Jalen's heart pounded. "I didn't do anything." "You fit the description," one officer growled. "Stay still." Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't cry. He clenched his jaw, kept breathing, and said only one thing. "Call my father." The officer scoffed. "And who's your daddy, huh?" Jalen looked him in the eye. "Senator Malcolm Carter." That was the moment everything changed. The name hit like a bullet in the quiet. Senator Malcolm Carter. At first, the officer holding Jalen against the wall didn't flinch. His grip was still firm on the teen's wrist, still rough, still assuming guilt. But the other officer, slightly older, maybe the one with more years on the force, froze mid-search. He looked up, eyes narrowing as if trying to process what had just been said. "What did you say?" Jalen didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. His body language said everything. Not defiant, not smug, just certain. There was something in the way he said it. Not like he was bluffing or trying to scare them, but like he knew exactly what kind of power he had behind him. The older officer stepped back, suddenly less sure of the situation. He looked at his partner, who now seemed caught between arrogance and creeping realization. "You got ID?" the older one asked. Jalen didn't move. "It's in my backpack." "You threw it on the ground." The younger officer, now clearly rattled, picked up the bag and fumbled through it. When he found the wallet and pulled out the school ID, he stared at it for a long second, then looked up again. Jalen Carter, Georgetown Prep. The name matched. The face matched. The ID was legit. That's when the second wave of panic hit them. Not the kind of panic that makes you yell or posture, but the cold kind. The kind that seeps into your spine when you realize you may have just made a career-ending mistake. Georgetown Prep was no ordinary high school. It was where senators' sons, diplomats' daughters, and elite students went. You didn't just grab a kid from Georgetown Prep on the street without reason. And you definitely didn't shove him against a wall, take his belongings, and accuse him of fitting a description without backup. Listen, the younger officer began, but Jalen had already stepped back. He was shaking, not from fear anymore, but from rage. His phone, now scratched from the pavement, buzzed with a call. He ignored it. He looked at them both, breathing hard, jaw tight. "You had no reason. You didn't ask questions. You saw me and assumed, 'We're just doing our job,'" the older officer said, but the words sounded paper thin. "No," Jalen snapped. "You're not. You didn't do your job. You did what you always do when someone like me is in your neighborhood." The camera across the street was still rolling. The woman holding the phone now had tears in her eyes. Not because she knew Jalen, but because she had seen this story too many times before. Except this time, something was different. This time, the kid wasn't going to disappear quietly. A black SUV pulled up within minutes, fast, government-tinted, sleek. A man in a suit stepped out, followed by a second. One flashed a badge, not for the public, but for the police. The kind that makes seasoned officers straighten up instantly. "Are you Jalen Carter?" the man asked, voice clipped. Jalen nodded. "Come with us. Your father's expecting you." The officers tried to explain themselves, tried to speak, but the agents didn't even look at them. Jalen walked to the SUV silently. Before he got in, he turned around just once. The look he gave wasn't angry, it was final, like a gavel striking wood. The kind of look that says, "I will remember this, and so will you." The door closed, the SUV pulled off, and the two officers stood frozen on the sidewalk, no longer in control, no longer so sure of their badges, with a name echoing in their heads, louder than any siren. Senator Malcolm Carter. The silence inside the SUV was thick, almost too calm. Jalen sat in the back seat, his fists still clenched on his lap, staring out the window as the city blurred by. The agent in the passenger seat didn't speak, but the one driving occasionally looked at Jalen through the rearview mirror, as if checking for signs of injury, or maybe signs of how deep the damage had gone. They didn't ask questions. They knew better. 10 minutes later, the car pulled up in front of a building few people in D.C. ever entered without clearance. The Carter residence. Tall gates, discreet security posts, a place of power masked as a quiet home. The door opened before Jalen even reached the steps, and there stood Senator Malcolm Carter. Tall, composed, tailored suit, but without the usual smile he wore in public. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, trained on his son like he already knew what had happened, like the city itself had whispered to him in advance. "Come inside," he said simply. Jalen followed. Inside, the calm exterior shattered. "Tell me exactly what they did," the senator said as they stood in his study. The door closed behind them. Jalen exhaled, his voice steady, but edged with frustration. "They didn't ask anything. They just saw me, decided I was a problem, and slammed me against a wall. Said I fit the description. They didn't even say of what his father didn't respond immediately. He paced once, hands behind his back, then picked up the house phone and made a call. Get me the chief of police." Now he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power obeys quiet authority. Within minutes, another call came in, then another. And by the end of the hour, a small meeting was scheduled, not at the police station, but in Carter's private office downtown. This was no press moment. This wasn't for cameras. This was about consequences. "Do you want to press charges?" Senator Carter finally asked Jalen. The question landed heavier than expected. "I don't know," Jalen said after a pause. "Would it even matter?" "It will," his father replied, "because we're not just making a point. We're making a record." Jalen nodded. He wasn't sure what justice looked like, but he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every kid who didn't have a senator waiting at home. Every kid who never got to say, "Call my father." Every kid who couldn't turn a moment like this into anything but trauma. And now, finally, he had the power to do something with it. Not because of who his father was, but because of what they had done to him. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, but word of it began circulating before the weekend was even over. It wasn't just that a senator was demanding accountability from a local police department. It was which senator and whose son. Malcolm Carter wasn't known for staying quiet, especially not when it came to civil rights and police reform. His history on the Senate floor made him a force to be respected, or feared, depending on which side of justice you stood on. Inside the sleek wood-paneled office in downtown D.C., the temperature felt colder than usual. A long glass table stood between two very different worlds. On one side sat Senator Carter, arms crossed, posture unshaken, with Jalen seated just beside him in a dark jacket, silent but present. On the other sat Police Chief Harrison, accompanied by two internal affairs officers and the department's PR advisor, whose tie looked a little too tight around the neck. The chief cleared his throat. "Senator Carter, first of all, let me say we're deeply sorry about what happened to your son." Malcolm raised a hand and the chief stopped mid-sentence. "I didn't call this meeting for apologies," the senator said, voice smooth but firm. "I called it for answers." Jalen looked around the room, watching the discomfort flicker across their faces. These men were used to speaking to reporters, not to consequences. The senator leaned forward. I want to know what protocol allows two officers to detain and rough up a minor without probable cause. I want to know why they didn't radio in before laying hands on him. And I want to know what your department intends to do about it. Chief Harrison glanced toward his colleagues, clearly prepared with rehearsed statements. There will be an internal review. Standard procedure. In the meantime, both officers have been placed on administrative leave. Paid leave? Malcolm asked, cutting in again. Yes, sir. Pending review. So, the senator said, leaning back in his chair, after physically assaulting my son and violating multiple civil rights, they're still collecting a paycheck? The silence that followed was thick. No one answered. Jalen shifted slightly but stayed quiet. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to remind everyone in that room that this wasn't about just one incident. It was about a system. Senator Carter stood up slowly. Here's what's going to happen, he said, pacing around the room. You're going to release the body cam footage. Publicly. Not weeks from now, not redacted, all of it. You're going to open an independent investigation, not your internal smoke and mirrors. And I will personally see to it that federal civil rights lawyers are present every step of the way. The PR man started to interject, but the chief silenced him with a raised hand. And if you don't, Malcolm added, his voice sharper now, you'll be answering to more than one Senate Oversight Committee. Because the next time this happens to a young black boy on your streets, it might not be the son of a senator, and you won't have a table to sit at when the country starts asking questions. No one spoke. Jalen stood, following his father toward the door. Just before they left, he paused and looked at the chief. You didn't believe me when I told you who my father was, he said quietly. But maybe now you'll start listening to kids like me, even when their dad isn't someone you fear. And then he walked out. Power didn't shout in that room. It simply left the door open behind it, and made sure everyone knew the storm was just beginning. By Tuesday morning, the headlines had caught fire. Local news stations ran the story first. Senator's son harassed by D.C. police. Then the national networks picked it up. Within 24 hours, Jalen Carter's name was trending across social media. Not as a suspect, not as a statistic, but as a symbol. A photo taken during the incident, Jalen's face pressed to the wall, one officer mid-search, the other gripping his arm, had gone viral, accompanied by 3 words, "Call my father." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What stunned people more than the mistreatment was that it had happened to someone so close to power, and what that meant for kids who weren't. Senator Carter, true to form, didn't waste time holding press conferences. He let the facts speak for themselves. The video footage was released just as he demanded. It was worse than expected. No hesitation, no communication, just force. The public outcry was immediate. Civil rights lawyers called the senator's office offering assistance. Activist groups began organizing marches. Hashtags began circulating. Hashtag Justice for Jalen. Hashtag Senator's Son. Hashtag Still Not Safe. But for Jalen, it wasn't about the cameras or the politics. It was about what happened when he walked back into school that week. Students who never spoke to him before gave him nods in the hallway. A few teachers pulled him aside, offering quiet apologies, not for what happened, but for not being surprised. One of his best friends, Malik, gave him a look that said everything without words. This could have been me, man. It still could be. In U.S. government class, the teacher hesitated before opening the textbook. Today, he said slowly, we're supposed to discuss the Bill of Rights. But I think we'd all rather hear from someone who just lived through them being violated. The class turned to Jalen. For a moment, he felt exposed, like he wanted to melt into the desk. Then he sat up straighter. He spoke quietly, but with more control than he ever had before. You grow up being taught to respect the badge. That police are supposed to protect you. But that's hard to believe when the badge sees you as a threat just because of your skin. He paused. I didn't feel safe. Not even in my own city. Not even when I did everything right. The room was silent. No debate, no challenge, just the weight of truth. That night, Jalen found his father in the study again, typing on his laptop. I'm sorry you're in the middle of this, Senator Carter said without looking up. Jalen shook his head. I'm not. Not anymore. Malcolm looked at his son, then really looked. You're sure? Jalen nodded. If I don't speak, then nothing changes. I'm tired of people acting like this is normal. A quiet pride settled over the room. You know they'll come for you now, right? Malcolm said. The media. The critics. People who will say this is just politics. Let them, Jalen replied. They saw what they saw. The senator smiled faintly. You sound more like me every day. But Jalen shook his head. No, I sound like me now. That's enough outside. Another headline lit up the screens. But inside, a young man had just found his voice, and the world was finally listening. The public fallout had only just begun. Within days of the footage going live, the DC Police Department held an emergency press briefing. Standing stiff at the podium, Chief Harrison announced that both officers involved in the incident had been suspended without pay, pending an independent investigation. It wasn't a full admission of guilt, but the tone was clear. They were trying to stop the bleeding. Meanwhile, Senator Malcolm Carter declined all interview requests. Not because he had nothing to say, but because his son's experience was now speaking louder than any prepared statement ever could. In private meetings, however, Malcolm was a storm. He used every ounce of political capital he had, every relationship built, every handshake remembered, to push legislation forward. A new bipartisan-backed police accountability bill, one that required stricter use of force training, transparent complaint tracking, and mandatory de-escalation courses. What was once just a terrifying moment for a teenager on a sidewalk was now transforming into federal pressure. And it wasn't because a senator was angry. It was because a father was done being patient. Jalen, on the other hand, had his own transformation underway. The once quiet, reserved kid who preferred sketching sneakers over making speeches was suddenly invited to speak at schools, youth panels, and community town halls. At first, he declined every single one. He didn't want to become a symbol. He didn't want pity. But then, one afternoon, he found a letter in his locker. No name, just a neatly folded sheet of notebook paper. Inside, in careful handwriting, it read, I saw what happened to you. Something like that happened to my brother last year. We didn't have anyone to fight for him. Thank you for not being quiet. Jalen read it twice, then tucked it into his wallet. He didn't say anything to anyone. But that night, he told his father, I'll do the town hall. When he stepped onto the stage of the local community center that weekend, he wasn't wearing a suit. No script, just jeans, a t-shirt, and a microphone in his hand. He looked out at the crowd, kids his age, parents, activists, reporters, and felt the nervousness in his chest turn into clarity. I'm not a hero, he began. I'm not brave. I was scared that day. But I'm standing here now because I want to make sure fewer people have to be. He told the story plainly, without drama, no embellishment. He didn't have to. The truth was powerful enough. And when he finished, the applause wasn't loud. It was steady, solid, full of respect. After the event, a small line of people waited to shake his hand. Some offered words, others just nodded, like they knew what it meant to survive something without ever having the words for it. That night, back home, Jalen pulled the folded letter from his wallet again. He read it one more time, then placed it carefully in his desk drawer. He was beginning to understand. Sometimes your voice isn't just yours. Sometimes it's the one others have been waiting for. And now that he'd started speaking, he wasn't planning on stopping. Months passed, but the city didn't forget. What happened on that sidewalk had echoed far beyond one neighborhood, one school, or even one police department. It became part of a national conversation, not because it was rare, but because it was recorded, because it was recognized, and because, for once, the ending didn't go silent. Jalen Carter had changed, not in the way trauma hardens people, though he did carry that day with him everywhere he went. He changed because he chose to step into the space that was created for him, the one that so many others had never been allowed to reach. He went from being someone who blended in to someone people looked to, and not just for speeches, but for substance. He interned at his father's office over the summer, sitting in on meetings with policymakers, civil rights lawyers, and even the Department of Justice. He watched how laws were shaped and how slowly change moved. He saw how often reform got buried in bureaucracy, how easy it was for officials to say, next session or we'll revisit it, until the urgency faded. But he also saw his father refuse to let it go. Malcolm Carter made sure the bill they had discussed, the one born out of Jalen's experience, didn't die on the floor. He gathered support across the aisle, built coalitions of lawmakers, and forced it into debate. By the time fall arrived, the Carter Youth Protection and Accountability Act had passed committee and was headed for a full vote. It wasn't sweeping, but it was real. It would mean changes in how minors were handled by police nationwide, with specific provisions to protect children of color from unlawful stops and aggressive force. It was the beginning of something bigger. At Georgetown Prep, Jalen returned to class with more eyes on him than ever. Some students treated him like a celebrity. Others avoided him, unsure of what to say. A few whispered behind his back. He didn't care. He wasn't there for approval anymore. He had seen too much to care about hallway politics. But what mattered most was what happened the day Officer Gray, one of the two who had pinned him to the wall, quietly submitted his resignation. There was no ceremony, no public apology. Just a name removed from the roster. Jalen read about it in an article that barely made the second page of the Metro section. He stared at it for a long time, unsure of what he felt. Relief? Closure? Maybe a little of both. But not satisfaction. Because the real victory didn't come from that officer walking away. It came from the fact that he couldn't walk away without the world watching. And that world was still watching Jalen too. Not long after, he was invited to speak at a televised Youth Justice Summit. The event was hosted at Howard University, and the room was filled with students, scholars, activists, and elected officials. This time, Jalen wore a blazer, not because he was trying to be someone else, but because he knew what the moment meant. He stood in front of the mic, took a deep breath, and began, "I'm here because I had a name people recognized. But most kids like me don't. Most of them don't have senators for fathers. Most of them don't have a camera watching when things go wrong. I was lucky. But justice shouldn't depend on luck." He paused, letting the truth sink in. Being black in America shouldn't be a risk factor. And walking home from school shouldn't be a gamble. We can't fix everything overnight. But we can make it harder to ignore. We can make it impossible to pretend it doesn't happen. When he finished, the crowd rose. Not in excitement, but in unity. Not for the name Carter, but for every name that hadn't been protected, every life that hadn't been heard. Jalen didn't smile as he stepped away from the podium. He wasn't done. There was more to fight for. But as he walked off stage, he passed his father in the front row. And for a moment, their eyes met. Not as senator and son, but as two black men who understood what it meant to be seen, to be tested, and to still be standing. And together they both knew the story that started with fear had ended in purpose.